Welcome everyone. This is Doug Cook. I use he, him pronouns. I live on what was Pawtucket land, currently known as South Hamilton, Massachusetts, in the Ipswich River watershed. I am the education coordinator for NOFA Mass. I'll be your host for tonight. Along with me is Rafi, who is an intern and studies at Greenfield Community College. We are welcoming you all to Perennial Gardens and Edible Hedges with Ruth Green. First, I always like to thank all the NOFA Mass staff and board who have helped make this workshop possible. We also want to thank our sponsors. Chelsea Green Publishing, an employee-owned company, brings in-depth practical content about organic gardening and more to life with books, ebooks, and audiobooks. Go to chelseagreen.com and enter code PWEB35 at checkout to receive a special NOFA Mass Resilient Garden Series discount on your next print book purchase. Chelsea Green Publishing, cultivating change from the ground up. And Ward's Nursery. At Ward's Nursery, they pride themselves on being a leader in offering horticultural products you can count on, knowledgeable staff you can trust, and friendly customer service. Ward's Nursery and Garden Center, where gardeners grow, located in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. As well, we are supported by the New England Biolabs Foundation, and you can learn more about New England Biolabs and their foundation at nebf.org. Of course, we want to thank you all for joining us tonight, especially our members who make our education and advocacy work possible. Please consider becoming a member or making a donation to help support our important work. We like to start off each event by remembering to take a look at this map. And it's a great place to start your education and learn more about the people who lived on the lands that we live on now, who lived here prior to our colonization. So please, learn about their present day political structures, their issues and goals. We suggest you also learn more about the ongoing history of Black exclusion from property and farmland ownership. Please consider making solidarity work with local Black and Indigenous people a part of your environmental and land-based work. We owe so much to what we know about how to farm and manage land in a regenerative and ecologically responsible way, not only to the people who were here before colonization, but the people who were brought to the United States as slaves. And rather than erase them, we should honor and support and seek justice for their descendants who have survived centuries of oppression and white supremacy. I'll drop some links into the chat for a few organizations that you can learn more about and follow and support. At this moment, I'd just like to acknowledge and express my gratitude to everyone for sharing this space together. And I encourage you to focus on your breath for a moment and feel the connection with your body and the place that you're in. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Ruth Green.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Doug. My name is Ruth Green, and I'm here to talk to you about including perennials, shrubs, and trees with edible fruit in your gardens. It would be helpful to have an idea of what kind of garden you're currently working at this point and what brought you to this webinar tonight. So if you're comfortable doing so, if you could please say a little bit about your interests in the chat while we get started here. Imagine that your interests are quite varied, from looking to add a few new blueberry bushes to the mix of edibles that you grow in your vegetable garden. While I'm talking, I'm going to share my screen. So I believe you could be interested in everything from adding a few blueberry bushes to your garden to providing food and habitat to the birds and beneficial insects in your neighborhood. We'll discuss as many different versions of these interests as time allows, and I plan to leave you with suggestions for perennials and woody plants to get you started thinking about the many possibilities that this approach can open up. So I can't see the chat, but I will take a look at it later, and I hope we cover the areas that you will be interested in tonight. And if you'll just give me a minute, I will advance these slides.
Try clicking on the presentation itself on your screen. Maybe that will.
Better. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm not technologically that advanced. Why include perennials and woody plants in our gardens in the first place? You're attending a NOFA webinar, so you have probably already thought about or learned to use fewer or no synthetic pesticides in your gardens already. It may seem that that leaves us with fewer options to deal with the pests that come to feast on our vegetables and flowers, but we can enlist the help of the natural world around us instead. I'm talking about beneficial insects and birds. And in the long run, this is a much more effective and sustainable solution for keeping our gardens in balance. We will look at how to attract birds and beneficial insects to our gardens and how to encourage them to stick around and make our gardens part of our home territory. In that way, they can assist us by eating the insects and other creatures that harm our crops and our flowering plants. Beyond what they can do for us, it is important to consider what we can do to assist our bird and insect friends to persist in the natural world around us. Both are under tremendous pressure because of pollution, habitat loss, and climate change, and anything we can do to encourage their health and diversity will benefit them and us alike. The health of our gardens starts with our soils. We need to maintain the natural structure as well as the composition of healthy soils if we want to keep our plants in healthy balance. And one important way to do this is to keep from disturbing the soil structure as much as possible. We'll talk more about this a little later. For now, please keep in mind that seasonal rototilling and deep digging in the soil to plant annual flowers and vegetables disturbs soil structure and breaks apart the fungal threads that are so important to the nutrient transfer that our plants need. Even vegetables need the fungi as well as the bacteria that are present in healthy soils. If we include undisturbed perennial plantings around and even in our vegetable gardens, we can maintain more fungi and we can grow healthy plants in our entire gardens. One way to do this is to establish any connection that we can with the plant communities that existed or still exist nearby our cultivated gardens. People who are lucky enough, excuse me, to live near a forest edge can look to that plant community for plants to include in their garden plans. Residential neighborhoods that were created from meadow or farmland also have plant communities with beneficial plants to incorporate in order to connect to the wider landscape. Urban gardens also can utilize plants that create fungally dominated soils to enhance their growing environment. We'll talk more about this as we get into plant selection. Perhaps you want to create windbreaks to give your annual and perennial gardens a calmer growing environment. Or you're looking for more privacy from the road or for neighbors. You can choose plantings that provide food and habitat at the same time as satisfying these requirements. We'll look at how to combine priorities when we decide on plants for the garden. And last but not least, all of us have limits to the amount of time we can spend in our gardens, no matter how much we want to accomplish out there. Perennials and woody plants can help us by contributing more of our food, both familiar and not so common, without needing so much planting and maintenance time. If you're like me, you still want to grow tomatoes, beans, squash, and any number of other annual vegetables every year. In fact, my onions are sprouted indoors and waiting for the right conditions to grow into the garden. I'll have more time to plant them properly if I can rely on the fruiting shrubs and trees to do their jobs too. We're going to touch on a lot of different aspects tonight, and you may want to pursue any or all of these subjects if they apply to your garden interests. This webinar series, Resilient Gardens, has brought together many knowledgeable practitioners who have discussed these topics in detail. Please take advantage of their expertise by watching the recorded webinars listed on NOFA's YouTube page. I am sure that you'll find the time worthwhile. So, Let's get started with the basics by looking at why you would want to attract insects to your garden at all. There are many more insects of the good variety than there are insects that will damage your garden in some way. To begin with, insects provide essential pollinating services to agricultural and wild plants. Insects are responsible for pollinating roughly 1/3 of the agricultural crops in the US. In addition, pollination provides seeds and plants for countless birds and other animal foragers. Many adult pollinators are also predators in their larval stage, and this can help keep damaging pests in check without the use of harmful pesticides. Let's talk first about bees. Often people think of honeybees when we talk about pollinators, and indeed honeybees do pollinate many fruit and vegetable crops important to our diets. However, honeybees have been in decline due to pesticides, constantly relocation, and predators like mites. Now we often need to rely on native bees and other insect pollinators to produce many of our essential crops. Fortunately for us, native bees are everywhere, and we have more than 4,000 species in the US alone. Native bees are more versatile than honeybees and can forage early and late in the day, and in more variable weather than their native counterparts. Our native bees are even described as keystone species, essential members of a balanced and sustainable ecosystem. This balance can be seen in our own gardens as well if we take certain steps to attract our bee friends and support their life cycle requirements. Our native bees include many solitary bees, like the carpenter and green sweat bees, as well as the leafcutter bees and orchard bees. Solitary bees rarely, if ever, sting, and each has particular plants that they pollinate, as well as special needs for habitat. They make up the majority of native bee species. We also have many bumblebees, some of which are solitary and some of which form colonies to rear their young. There are many other pollinators we want to encourage in our gardens, and I've shown some examples of them here. Hoverflies are often mistaken for bees, which incidentally protects them from being eaten by predators that don't relish eating bees. And they often pollinate some of the same crops as bees would. Wasps are less likely to be pollinators because they lack the leg hairs that make it easier to collect pollen. But this little pollen wasp, for example, is different because it needs the pollen and nectar to support its young. Butterflies also are less efficient pollinators than bees, but have evolved to support important plants in our ecosystem. The same goes for hummingbird moths and hummingbirds and the plants they pollinate. Beetles are better known as recyclers of garden debris, but also have their own group of plants that rely on them for pollination. So what do we do about the bad bugs that eat our plants and produce in the garden? It's too easy to reach for a spray or powder to kill them off, and I'm going to encourage you to take a step back from that approach, even if the insecticide is approved for organic use. These chemicals are mostly broad-spectrum killers, which means they eliminate a wide variety of the beneficial bugs we are trying to attract, as well as the pests. They can even make things worse because we end up killing the pest's natural predators along with the culprit. When the pests return, there are no predators left to keep them in check, and we end up using more and more chemicals instead. That's what this page is about. Here are some examples of predator insects that can help us keep pests in check if we let them. If you've seen a tomato hornworm in all its creepy glory, then you know that it can take down half of your tomato plant in half a day. Of course, you can pick off the tomato hornworms, but if you see one that looks like this, it's best to leave it be. A tiny braconid wasp has laid its eggs in the hornworm, and you are seeing the larvae about to hatch and kill the hornworm without our help. Soon many more wasps will be present to help us out. It's just one example. These other insects often eat pests or lay eggs in them, and we won't even see them doing it. But they will come to our gardens if we keep them pesticide free. Birds can also help us by eating caterpillars or feeding them to their young chicks, so we want to encourage the birds as well. Some of our pollinators are referred to as generalists and are content to find nectar and pollen wherever they can. And others need the flowers of certain families to survive and create provisions for their developing offspring. This affects many of the foods we want to grow. Here are some examples of vegetables and fruits that rely on specific insects to pollinate their flowers. It's not an exhaustive list, but it will give you some idea of the insects that you will want to attract depending on what crops and other plants you want to grow. And of course, we all need seeds to plant, which may involve more insects still to pollinate the necessary flowers. So, how do we attract our pollinator friends to our gardens? We can start by choosing helpful combinations of flowering plants that the pollinators have learned to recognize as sources of food and habitat over many years of evolution. In other words, the plants that are native to our particular regions. This also means planting flowers that bloom very early and late in the growing season, as well as in high summer. Many pollinators emerge soon after the weather changes in spring and need nourishment right away. Here are some examples of early bloomers like the spring ephemerals that bloom in deciduous forests before the canopy leaves out and reduces the available light. You can include many of these in your own gardens in part sun, part shade areas. Native columbine and foam flowers are also good choices with their abundant flowers and adaptability to sun and shade. Good choices for summer flowers include these wild geraniums and mountain mint, as well as turtleheads, some milkweed varieties, and lobelia or cardinal flowers. As I mentioned, fall flowers are important because many of our pollinators need to find nectar and pollen to provision their overwintering eggs for hatching next spring, as well as to build up their own reserves to make it through the off-season. Here are some examples of native fall flowering plants, many of which will bloom until frost. Some of these plants double as overwintering shelters for insects and their eggs because of their hollow stems. So it's a good idea not to be too ready to cut down the garden and tidy everything up in the fall. If we leave these plants standing through the winter, we can have many more pollinators in our gardens next year. Let's keep in mind some of these flowering trees and shrubs as well when planting our perennial and hedge gardens. The eastern redbud, mountain laurel, and flowering shrubby dogwoods add important sources of nectar and pollen for early foragers. And the chokeberry and bush honeysuckle often follow with their blooms soon after. Now, excuse me. Quite often I've found that when people think about hedges, the first thing that comes to mind is a mass planting of a single species of woody plant. In some cases, this makes perfect sense. However, as we experience the effects of climate change, it's becoming more apparent that single species garden plantings are more vulnerable to pests, diseases, and all-around unsuitability to changing weather conditions. In the next few slides, I'm going to encourage you to look at a different approach. Our gardens represent an investment in time and money, no matter what their size. And sustainability is the overriding principle we need to consider as conditions around us become more unpredictable. With mixed species plantings, we can keep the original intent of our gardens intact, even if we lose a few plants here and there as the climate changes, instead of losing the whole planting. Here, for example, is a shrub border designed to keep something in bloom through the entire season, which supports our pollinators as well as maintaining our interest. Spireas, hydrangeas, and beauty bushes predominate. Because the spirea is a cultivar, none of these plants are true natives, but all of them provide nectar and pollen to bees and other insects for approximately 3 months of the season. I'm going to say a word about cultivars, or cultivated varieties of native plants. They don't function as host plants for insects that are looking for the original native species, and can even confuse some insects to lay their eggs on the cultivar instead of the native plant. When the eggs hatch, the larvae will try to eat the cultivar and many will die because it doesn't provide the right nutrients. So if you want to provide a host plant for a particular insect, stick with the species instead of the cultivated variety of that plant. Now, the key to this garden bed is that there is more going on than you can see in this photo. In the spring, early ephemerals and bulbs support the pollinators, and in late summer, native black-eyed Susans flower and support many late feeding bees and butterflies and act as a larval host for some butterflies and moths in the same garden. We don't cut down any of these plants until the following spring because the birds love to eat the black-eyed Susans during the fall. This perennial border includes feverfew, salvia, yarrow, asters, and columbines in the late spring and early summer. Again, all are cultivars, not ideal for habitat support, but they do provide nectar and pollen for pollinating insects. The central feature of this garden is also its seasonal diversity, just like the last one. Here's a picture of the same late season border. Now the black-eyed Susans and hyssops take over and provide nectar, pollen, and habitat for our pollinators as the flowers of other plants become more scarce. So how do we get started in our own gardens? The first thing is to consider what plants we already have. You'll never hear me suggest that you take out your existing garden to begin with a clean slate. We gardeners can always find a way to add to our existing gardens when our interests and priorities change. Before visiting the nursery, however, it's a good idea to get as realistic an assessment as possible of what space is available and how much time we have to get those plants in the ground. All too often, I have to admit, I've done exactly the opposite. Still, it's a lot easier to at least be clear about how many perennials and woody plants we can introduce to our gardens at any one time. Most importantly, we need to know how much sun and shade we currently have before picking out the new recruits. I say currently because the surrounding landscape can really change as it grows, and the available light changes with it. And it's helpful to be clear about what has happened since the last time we put plants in the ground. If you have the time to amend the soil first, so much the better. Remember that we now want to encourage fungal growth to support these woody plants and perennials, where we may have been concentrating on bacterial growth for edible annuals previously. The best way to do that would be to start the previous fall with leaves, fungally dominated compost, by which I mean cold compost, and any needed soil amendments and wood chips to encourage fungi to colonize the garden over the fall and winter. Be sure to get a soil test before you start adding soil amendments because, trust me, you can get it wrong. That's why I have so much phosphorus in my garden. But I learned the hard way. Starting the previous fall is not always possible. So my advice in those situations is to plant everything in native soil and add amendments and then leaves or mulches on top. Remember, soil health is an ongoing affair. It's important to keep adding to soil fertility with organic materials and mulch each fall and spring at least to maintain an active biological life underneath our perennials and woodies. A complete discussion of soil fertility is beyond our scope here, but worth all the effort you can put into learning about it and improving the soil that you have. Finally, it's a good idea to get the biggest and/or slowest growing specimens in the ground first, so that they have time to get established over the first season or two of our new planting plans. We can add perennials over time as our budget allows. So enough theory, what about the plants? Let's look at a couple of hypothetical gardens to get some ideas about how to combine priorities into a planting plan. In this garden number 1, let's imagine that we already have a mature crab tree on one side of the yard and lilacs and hydrangeas off to the other side. The forest edge is within 100 feet of the property. Now we want to plant some edible berries in the middle, and we also want to attract pollinators and predator insects to keep the garden in balance. These plants can satisfy our hypothetical priorities. The mountain laurel is a good choice because it is already present in the woodland beyond this garden. Any pollinators attracted to this area will easily include the new shrubs in their foraging. Then the nannyberry, which you see on the right there, it's a hardy viburnum. It produces sweet blue-black fruits in the fall. Its flavor is sometimes described as a cross between a banana and a prune. You may like bananas and you may not like prunes, or the other way around, but you get them both. The fruits are persistent, meaning the birds will eat them through the winter. But if you harvest any of them for yourself, you're going to want to keep an eye on them as they ripen. And then there's the pussy willow. It's a member of one of the most important plant species for conserving wildlife because it blooms so early. Pollinators of all kinds are drawn to the exploding flowers for their nectar and pollen. Willows provide another benefit to our gardens, according to Michael Phillips, whom some of you know from his books on holistic apple orchards. Willow's roots can sometimes run to hundreds of feet, connecting fungal communities in the forest with soil in our gardens, and that's a good reason to include it in our planting plans if there's a forest habitat nearby. These 3 shrubs make up the taller back of our hedge. The more compact aronias and the sweet pepper bush or clethra can be planted in front. Sweet pepper bush, which is on the right in the middle there, can be planted is a good choice to be planted because it blooms midsummer after many of the other flowering shrubs have already produced their flowers for the season. And that makes it very attractive to the insects and hummingbirds seeking nectar. And it's a larval host for some of our butterflies. Many people are now interested in aronia berries, especially the black aronias, for their high levels of antioxidants. And you'll see the black aronia there on the in the middle left. The fruit is best combined with a sweeter berry for preserves because it isn't all that palatable by itself. However, you may be interested to know that there's a natural hybrid native to New England known as the purple aronia, and it's pretty sweet. It's a cross between the black and the red aronias, a natural cross, and I found them at Nasami Farm, the Native Plant Trust's nursery in Western Mass, and you may be able to find it too in your own native plant nurseries. And it germinates from seed. This year, I'll be planting saplings that I wintered over last fall, and I'm looking forward to finding good spots for them. Now to the perennials. Remember that we want flowers in our garden from as early as possible in the season to keep our pollinators happy and healthy. The bloodroot is one of the earliest plants to flower, and it's shade tolerant, so we can tuck it in under some of our shrubs. Native lupins come next in May and June, depending on where you live. The native lupin that's known as sundial is the real prize here because it is the host plant for the endangered Carner blue butterfly. If you can't find these plants, then you can grow them pretty easily from seed. Native spotted geranium can last into July, at which point the black-eyed Susans can support more pollinators into September. Before we leave this garden, let's back up and talk about spring bulbs. Daffodils, while not native, bloom throughout the spring and can feed many of our pollinators until the native perennials appear on the scene. So let's look at garden number 2. Our second garden is not in the woods at all. In fact, it's on the edge of farmland and thus open to the prevailing winds. Our first priority is to get some woody plants in the ground to provide a windbreak for the tender annuals we want to grow in the vegetable garden. Birds are important to us here, and we want to provide food and shelter for them in winter as well as during the growing season. And finally, we'll plant a perennial border to supply some cut flowers as well as food and habitat for wildlife. Let's start with the hedge for the windbreak. Please consider again planting more than one species to minimize the risks associated with relying on a single species. We're looking at a deciduous windbreak here and not an evergreen one because we're most concerned about a windbreak in the growing season. This sweet crabapple, which by the way is actually a native crabapple in New York State. It's about the only one that I could find. Its pink flowers attract many pollinating insects in the spring. But most important are the many small fruits that are readily eaten by birds. The ironwood or hop hornbeam produces nutlets that the birds consume in winter. Both trees are hardy and survive a wide variety of soils and weather conditions. The two shrubs that we're looking at in front of them, which are the shrubby St. John's wort and the common ninebark, also provide seeds for birds as well as flowers for pollinators. For cut flowers, a combination of composites or daisy-like flowers and taller spikes will make an interesting arrangement of blooms in the vase. Each of these perennials supports pollinators too, providing nectar and pollen and acting as host plants for a variety of butterflies and moths. And finally, we have garden number 3. It's a bit more complicated because it has developed over a long period of time. There are already some edible fruits growing here, and now we want to include more edibles, as well as more natives for wildlife habitat. This garden is right on a forest edge, so sun and shade must be carefully considered. The big issue here will be finding room for new plants while maintaining the integrity of the existing garden. You may have guessed this is my garden. It's a work in progress for 30 plus years now, and it's seen all kinds of replanting and reinventions. I haven't included plant names on this slide, but you will find them on the handout you'll be receiving by email, in addition to other plants we've talked about tonight. My garden is surrounded on 3 sides by forest, and some of these species show up here as well, including the mountain laurel up here, and the wild cherry, that's what's over in flower over here. And there are white pines, smaller ones, dotted in various places. I inherited some wild blueberries. There's one here and one over here. And they came from the previous owner, and they're great for pollinators and fall foliage, as well as for delicious fruit. There's shadberry or serviceberry right here, and it gets pollinated by butterflies and hummingbirds. It's also an important larval host for many butterflies and moths. Over time, I've added elderberry, that's right here. These are silky dogwoods, another native. And this is a red twig dogwood, all natives. Winterberry is right here. And this ninebark, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, this is a cultivar of a native, and this is Joe Pye weed. I chose red elderberry because it's a favorite of the birds, and that worked. I was so excited because now I have rufous-sided towhees, and they're regular visitors to my garden, when the berries ripen. They're a mixed blessing because they also eat my peas, but I love to see them anyway. They're really beautiful. The elderberries also provide shade for my wine cap mushroom bed. There are a few non-natives in the garden, including this Shasta viburnum and this one down here, which is called a red vein enkianthus. It's true that they're not native, but I can tell you that when they are in flower, the bees are all over them. This year, I'm adding nannyberry and black haw, the two native viburnums that will act as host plants for any pollinators that are attracted to this non-native viburnum. The same goes for this 9-bark. The native plant has green leaves, and I'll plant it next to Diabolo over here. This is a popular burgundy-leaved cultivar of 9-bark, and I'm hoping that what happens is that any pollinators that are looking for a host plant will choose the green-leaved one instead. And finally, I'm putting in one of my favorite spring flowering trees, a redbud. The redbud is host to the Henry's elfin butterfly. Keep in mind that these plants bloom at all different times. My garden doesn't look like this exactly, but nevertheless, there's always something blooming to attract pollinators to the garden. Many of the pollinators are also predators, especially at the larval stage, as I've mentioned, so they help keep pest populations under control. My native perennials include bloodroot over here and over here. These little guys, the yellow flowered trout lilies, and as well, I have a white form of the trilliums. These beautiful blue ones, these are Virginia bluebells, and all 4 of those plants willingly self-seed, and I have great time finding where they're going to sprout next spring. Okay, folks, here's the juicy part. The native black cherries and the shadbush berries are bird favorites, but I may actually try to get to eat a few this spring because they're edible by people too. The winterberry over here and the Shasta viburnum don't last very long because the birds eat those too, and the same goes for the dogwoods here and here and the elderberries. My big annual project, though, is to harvest the blueberries after a really large, old, wild blueberry plant. I cover the lower branches of this blueberry, and I try to share with the robins and the blue jays before they clean me out, because I leave the taller branches for them. I can't reach them anyway. This garden's berries also ripen at different times, so there's food for wildlife here as well as for me. And it happens for months. Now I want to point out that these are the native berries in my garden, and you'll notice the black cherry and the American plum over here, and then the elderberry and the dogwoods and the winterberry are the ones that I plant for the birds, and then of course there's the blueberries for me. It's always been my goal to plant shrubs with 3 seasons of interest at least. Some of them are beautiful in the winter too, like the red and yellow stem dogwoods and all of the other intricately branched specimens. These native babies, put on quite a show in the fall with red and yellow leaves everywhere. There aren't a lot of maples around in my neighborhood, but I have plenty of color to look at anyway, and it's a real pleasure to see them as the growing season comes to an end. And all of these leaves get left in place to decompose and add nutrients to the soil for future years. Now, a friend of mine who's not even a gardener sent this around recently. Guess we gardeners have a reputation. I've included it as a reminder to us all to take it easy when planning to make changes to our gardens. There is a saying that we should take our plans for the season and cut them in half. Not that I've ever managed to do it, but it helps to remember that whatever we can do to help our natural world and provide more healthy food for ourselves, it's all worth doing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I did share the plant list in a link. So folks, if you click that link, you'll have that information. Again, I will share that in a follow-up email, as well as a reading list that Ruth recommends. Now is a great time to jump into some questions. So, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the great questions. If you love this event, please remember to make a small donation or become a NOFA Mass sustaining member. To start us off, there's a bunch of great questions. So I think we'll start in with a little bit about how we're thinking about spacing our plants and planning for all these. Like you said, we have big plans, and so one person asked, I have a large space. I'm planning to plant all native plants. The space is about 55 by 26 feet, and maybe keeping half of that for grasses. How do we figure out how many perennial natives we'll need for a space of that size?
Well, I would suggest deciding on what kind of perennials or shrubs you're interested in first, and then reviewing the literature, and there's a lot of it, either at the nursery or in all kinds of books and online, that will tell you what the mature size of the plant is. And that doesn't mean that you have to leave 10 feet on either side if it turns out that the plant itself at a mature stage, meaning 10 to 15 years from now, is going to turn out to be 20 feet wide. But a suggestion is that it's best to leave about 3/4 of the mature size as the space between that one and the next plant. Believe me, it's way too easy to crowd them in because they look so small when we get them. But it's a really good idea to try as much as possible to leave adequate space for them to grow so that you don't have to keep moving them around.
Mhm. And when we're starting from scratch, what do you think about invasive species? And if they're in your where you're planning to plant, how would you go about working with or removing invasive species?
Well, it depends on what invasive species it is. There are some where you can put down cardboard as as big pieces of cardboard as you can find. It's, a lot of people suggest going to appliance stores and getting those really big sheets of cardboard or whatever you can find, putting that down, putting compost on top of that, and then putting mulches or leaves um, on top of the compost and the cardboard, and leaving that for a year, because that will kill whatever it is that's underneath it. And then the earthworms and other soil organisms will eventually eat that cardboard, and you will end up with a fertile garden with the invasive plant killed. There are unfortunate, I mean, it really depends on what kind of invasive plant it is. There are unfortunately plants like bishop's weed, for example, that's spread by runner roots. And all you're going to do in that case is just feed the invasive plant. So in those situations, it's almost certainly going to be more useful to take clear plastic and put it over the top of your invasive plant area. You got to have some hot days for this, but you may have to leave that plastic on there for a season. But the idea here is that you kill off those plants basically by boiling them, and get as many of them out in that manner as you can. So it's really heartbreaking to get a lot of plants in the ground that you want to keep when you've got invasive plants spreading their roots through your new planting. So I would say start with that first.
Mhm. And in that same vein, Kristen asked me in an email about planting into an existing wooded edge. If there are certain techniques to use, Kristen was concerned that they might damage the roots because the roots are so dense.
Mm.
What would you say?
Well, I think it's good to keep in mind what kind of a wooded edge it is. Oak trees, for example, their roots tend to go straight down. to quite a depth. Maple trees, on the other hand, maple tree roots spread out laterally, and they're much more difficult to plant close up. So you'll want to keep a certain distance from certain types of trees, depending upon how much root competition you're going to have. The other consideration is where your woodland edge is and whether or not it's going to be shading the garden that you're developing. And you really want to observe that woodland edge and see how much sun and how much shade you're dealing with before you decide on what plants to put in the ground.
Mm-hmm. I just noticed a couple of questions about Japanese knotweed. So back to the invasives, what do you suggest for Japanese knotweed?
It's a tough one. Japanese knotweed, I know that some people take a mowing approach with Japanese knotweed, which means that right from the beginning of the season, they just mow it and mow it and mow it and deprive the plant of chlorophyll. And in some cases that will kill it. If it doesn't, you may have to actually get in there and dig it out, which is, I know it's a gargantuan job, but you may have to do that. But I suggest starting by mowing it regularly so that it just can't get any chlorophyll and get going in the early season.
Mm-hmm. And Jeff asked just now about bamboo. Would there be some similarities there?
Ouch. Now, I don't have any experience with bamboo. I know that some of them are clumping varieties and some of them are spreading. And, I don't recommend tilling, but in some cases you may really have to till these things to break up the root structure and then solarize it to kill them.
Mm-hmm. And while we're on that same topic, someone asked about poison ivy.
Yeah, poison ivy, I guess it depends on what kind. Poison ivy is a native, and that doesn't help anybody who actually gets poison ivy from the plant. Um, it it can it can be killed. I use a spray on these kinds of things that's made of vinegar and lemon juice. If it's poison ivy that's growing in the sun, if you pick a hot sunny day, you can certainly start to attack it by using vinegar and lemon juice. Perennial weeds are more difficult than annual weeds in this case, but I would start there, and then eventually you may very well have to really suit up and get in there and dig it out.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, someone also asked about chokeberry and would it make sense to move some chokeberry if they wanted to, move plants like that? Could you recommend plants that you find easily propagated and or that we might propagate ourselves or that would be worth propagating from wild cultivars?
Well, chokeberry can be moved. The ones that you'll have difficulty moving are the ones with deep tap roots. So I don't recommend that. It depends on what plant you're looking at. But if the roots are generally lateral roots, meaning spreading across underneath the soil laterally as opposed to going very deep, then you can move them. It's fine. And as far as propagating, that depends. It depends on the plant. It varies case to case. But I certainly, there are certainly some great books on the subject. The Bill Kalina's books, for example, on native perennials and on native trees and shrubs. There's some good treatments of how to propagate those plants in the back of, particularly in the back of his books. It's pretty extensive. So I suggest you take a look at some of his writing, and you'll get some good ideas.
Thanks. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the design aspects. Laura emailed me and asked about growing a somewhat tallish privacy hedge that is a little bit in the shade. Can you recommend any plants that that would provide some privacy in a shaded setting?
No. A lot of hedges end up pretty much in the sun. Um, shade. Well, mountain laurel, for example, can grow in shade as well as sun. In fact, mountain laurel um, mostly prefers to be protected from sun in the afternoon. So that would be a good one. If rhododendrons are native in your area, then rhododendrons are another really good hedge plant, and they fill in pretty nicely. And so those broad-leaved evergreens, they tend to be shade tolerant as well as flowering in the sun.
Cool. There are a couple of questions that talk about, how to keep some of these, birds and other things from eating some of the fruit that we want to grow. Do you recommend any particular coverings for, say, your blueberries to keep the birds off?
Well, you know what? I tried the black plastic netting for years, and I had a couple problems with it. And basically, that it would, first of all, it would stick to the plants, and a lot of the berries would fall off that way, and the birds themselves could kind of sit on that netting and eat berries to their heart's content. So I prefer to use season extension fabric like Agrabah or Rime and cover the branches of the fruiting shrubs that way. You get enough light in there, maybe they may very well, the fruit may very well mature a little more slowly, but I haven't noticed any really big changes between just leaving them uncovered and putting Agrabah or another season extension fabric on it. That's been my most successful method.
Mhm. And do you recommend anything for folks who have heavy deer pressure?
Well, they all work. All the deer repellents work. The trick to deer repellents is that you have to change them all the time because deer will get used to anything. So I don't recommend one over the other. I'm afraid you are going to have to spray if you have real problems with it. If it's very serious pressure, you may have to consider fencing. Either a solid, I'm a solid, either a fence that might be even as much as 7 feet tall, or you might go with electric fencing. In which case, there are some very good recommendations out there for how to bait that fence so that the deer realize that there is an electric fence there. Some people use monofilament um, as a as a as a material to keep the deer away, because what the deer really want is to be able to judge how high the material is that they have to jump over. And if they can't figure it out, that will sometimes make them back off. I mean, whatever, in addition to deer repellents, the big thing that you're trying to do is to get them to not use your garden for trails anymore, because whether you see them or not, deer run on trails, and you're trying to reorient them away from your garden. So any kind of barriers or fencing or electric fencing would be my suggestion if your deer pressure is really terrible.
Hmm. And Gwen asked about predator scent, like a coyote urine.
I haven't tried it. I can't really say, whether it works or not, but I do know that, I have to keep reapplying it as it rains.
Hmm. And I have a couple of specific plant questions.
Mhm.
One is, do you have any recommendation for a serviceberry species that is low growing rather than tall that would provide nice large juicy berries?
I don't, but in my opinion, that's why we invented pruners and loppers. You can keep almost anything, especially a plant like that, to the height that you want to keep it at if you learn how to prune it properly. I will say that conifers are much harder to prune than deciduous, but with a serviceberry, you can keep it to the height that you want.
Mhm. And another question was about erosion control. Do you have any species that you would recommend to control erosion in a slightly shady site?
I'll answer that question, but I want to go back to the pruning question first. And that is that what we've learned, a lot of people have learned, I would say, over time, I know it took me a while, is that if you're pruning for height, the best time to prune is right around the solstice, because at that point, the woody plant has actually exhausted its spring reserves of sugars, of carbohydrates. And so if you prune it then, you're going to have more success in keeping it to the height that you want it. If you prune in early spring, what happens is that you release a growth hormone that will cause an explosion of growth. So if you're pruning for to thin something out, you could do it in the spring, that's fine. But for height, do it in the summertime after the plant has grown. So erosion control. Um, did you say shade?
Partial sun, yeah, so some shade.
Partial sun. Well, shrubby willows are the go-to plant for erosion control. It depends on what eventual garden form you want this garden to take, but shrubby willows are generally considered to be a great plant for erosion control. And I'll say that you practically need to just get bare root. I mean, you really can just get bare root plants and stick them in the ground, and they will spread like mad. If that's not the kind of situation that you want, where you're looking to have a single species planting like that, then I recommend possibly some terracing, and definitely consider some um, uh, some mulch to get in there and allow the water to infiltrate into the soil as much as possible. The more you work on that soil, the better chances you have of keeping that erosion control to a minimum, because then the water will infiltrate instead of running off.
And in that sort of same vein, some folks mentioned the idea of permaculture and the use of mulch. Would that be another component of erosion control? And what type of mulches would you recommend?
Right. Well, mulch is a funny thing. I'll start by saying don't ever use a dyed mulch, one of these dyed bark mulches. You're just putting poison on the ground, because those dyes are, it's just, some chemical that's applied to the mulch. And personally, now I have to say that in my clients' gardens, I generally use a pine bark mulch, the native color. It's very nice. If if you don't keep digging around in there too much over the course of the season, and if you watch it when you clean up in the fall, then you can keep it going for maybe a couple of seasons. It really depends, or at least to top it off in the second season when you come back and look at it again. Personally, I really prefer leaves, either shredded or not. At this point, I find the nutrients in leaves are very beneficial to the soil and the organisms that exist in the soil. And you can't beat it. It's free. It's just a wonderful material. So unless you're doing this for someone else, where that particular appearance of bark mulch is what they want, then I would go with leaves.
Yeah. And for ground nesting bees as well, it's important to have a leaf cover.
Absolutely.
And what are your thoughts about natural cedar mulch?
I've actually never used it. So um, maybe somebody else wants to chime in here and say something about it. If I'm not mistaken, cedar is one of those materials that inhibits growth of other plants, so I would be cautious about it.
Mhm. Could you talk a little bit more about the conifers and evergreens that you use in your gardens?
Sure. Um, Conifers. I haven't really done too much with conifers, I have to admit, but I mean, I love hemlocks. it's a little bit of a dicey situation at this point because of the hemlock woolly adelgid. But we have many native conifers that are really quite lovely, like the spruces, the firs, the white pines, a variety of pines. That's certainly what I would consider. Um, there are cultivars like the mugo pines, the shorter ones, the variegated pines. The thing that you have to keep in mind with the conifers is that they need sun.
Another question came in, would you recommend any native grasses that we might put into these, hedgerow systems or on the edges, and in particular, one that would grow well in a partial sun setting?
Partial sun. Um, it's been a few years since I've used the grasses. Let's see, Pennisetum is a very pretty grass. I think Dan Jaffe talks about a native grass that can actually substitute for turf grass. And Doug, maybe you remember that conversation, but um, I, I apologize, but I haven't really used grasses in some time. So so Pennisetum is one that I really like, and the Panicum virginicum is another one that's really quite pretty.
Hmm. Is that Pennsylvania sedge?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
Pennsylvania sedge.
Great. Yeah, I know Dan Jaffe recommends Pennsylvania sedge if you're looking for a lawn look-alike.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm. Um, Excellent. So I see another couple of questions about pests. So let's go back to that. One person asked about controlling voles and asked about a specific plant called the mole plant. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes, I do. The mole plant is I don't know really whether it works. I've planted them. They pop up in my garden here and there all the time. Moles and voles are, well, not moles so much, but voles are really very difficult. Some people go so far as to install hardware cloth uh, at a quarter-inch uh, um, mesh so that the little guys can't get through, and they drop it down into a trench that's about 2 feet deep around gardens that they're trying to keep the little critters out of. I haven't actually had any success with doing that. Some people, I know that sometimes there are certain plants that will keep them away, like alliums. I haven't had any luck with marigolds for any of those kind of rodents. In fact, the rabbits, for example, will hop right over my marigolds to eat my broccoli. So much for that idea. But the exclusion is the only real possibility with those voles, and don't expect it to work perfectly because even the hardware cloth will wear out after a certain period of time. It's really, believe me, I sympathize. Um, the bane of my existence is chipmunks, and I really don't have a good answer.
Hmm.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the theme of woodchucks is alive in our chat. Donna mentioned planting Hellebores fotitis around their shady shed to keep woodchucks out. Do you have any thoughts about woodchucks?
Oh yeah. I have used sulfur bombs um, with tunneling rodents, generally speaking, and sometimes that works. It's not a good idea to use it near edible plants like your vegetables. Um, you know, what we're talking about here is possibly killing rodents in the tunnels. So if that's more than you want to get into, then don't take that approach. But I have used sulfur bombs to some good effect. Be careful, follow the instructions on that one. Um, Woodchucks, you you can call someone who will trap them and relocate them for you. A lot of people, and this isn't an original thought. A lot of people have very mixed emotions about relocating wild animals because it may seem humane, but in fact, what you're doing is you're transferring them to a place where they are not familiar with anything, and they generally don't live very long. So it is possible to relocate animals, but it's problematical. So, with woodchucks, um, they, the the remedies that I would suggest for moles and voles are just not strong enough. So relocation is probably your best bet.
There are some more interesting things going on in the chat talking about ways to get rid of voles. So might move on to another pest. And speaking of actually chipmunks, Sharon, I like your comment about installing a screech owl box and thinking about the predators coming in. To switch topics a little bit, back to some of the more plants focused stuff. Do you recommend anything for people who are interested in weaving baskets? Any plants that they might grow in their hedges or on their property for basket weaving?
Yes, well, actually, the shrubby dogwoods and the shrubby willows. There's a woman in my community that makes wonderful baskets, and she plants those two plants, shrubby willows and shrubby dogwoods, and harvests them every year. So that's your best bet.
Mm-hmm. And Amber is asking about what type of plants would you recommend for a hedge that would produce fruit for humans in an urban setting near the outside of a yard near the street?
Well, blueberries. I'm going to say that, or aronia berries. That's a possibility, but blueberries are wonderful. And I'm not going to recommend any of the cane fruits like raspberries or blackberries because they spread, and you're going to find yourself digging them out of every part of your garden as the years go by. So you want something that's a pretty discreet shrub like a blueberry.
Mm-hmm. And while we're on that topic, what do you think of autumn olive? I know in some places it's invasive.
Mhm.
And what do you think about autumn olive?
Well, in Massachusetts, where I live, it is invasive and it's illegal to sell it. So I would say no,
Mhm.
don't go for it. You're just asking for trouble.
Mhm. Um, Louise asked, what did you mean by shrubby willows? Could you
Oh,
speak to that
sure.
again?
Well, there are some willows that turn into gigantic trees, like the black willow. And then there are some smaller willows, like pussy willows, that stay relatively smaller in stature. They won't go over, they won't go over 10 to 15 feet. But again, that's when you want to get out your loppers if you want them to be shorter.
Okay. Someone brought up a planting question. In particular, they have heavy clay soil and have had very little success planting into that. Do you recommend some ways that you might ameliorate that heavy clay soil?
Yeah, I've had this problem too. My garden, my property is pretty much on ledge rock. It's clay over ledge rock. But it's not like that the soil itself is not like that anymore because I've been working on it for quite some time. And the idea here is to build the soil up rather than to try to infiltrate the clay itself. So I would suggest go with what's called lasagna gardening. Get some, you don't even have to have cardboard in that case unless you've got a plant that you want to kill at the same time. But get layers of compost and uh, plant material in there and layer them, and then put some kind of a mulch or cover over those layers of material over the winter so that you can start to, basically have a layer of topsoil on top of that clay. There are also, if you have the time, I would also suggest that you seriously consider cover crops, because things like daikon radish and other tap-rooted cover crop varieties will drill right down into that clay and create holes in it so that the water can infiltrate, and so that the earthworms and other biological biology that you have in the soil can start to mix the clay with the better soil that's on top of it. So definitely tap-rooted cover crops and lasagna layering of good soils on top of it.
Mhm. Leela asked, do you suggest building up soil on a hill? And is there any ground covers that we can grow that will sort of retain that soil?
Yeah, absolutely. There's one of them is called Green and Gold. You'll find it on the plant list that I made for this program, and that's a really good ground cover. It spreads beautifully. It can handle some sun and some shade. Another one Dan Jaffe recommends is wild strawberry. Is a fantastic ground cover, and that spreads very vigorously, and it's native. So yeah, definitely there are some nice ground covers. I wouldn't go with the vinca anymore. It's borderline invasive. It will certainly take over any other plants it happens to encounter in its spreading through your garden. So I don't recommend that. But green and gold is one of them, and then the wild strawberry is another really good one.
Mhm. Yes, I remember Dan Jaffe speaking highly of the wild strawberry for its benefits to pollinators.
Indeed.
Uh, so as well, we'd just like to sort of move over to some more plant-specific questions. Someone is asking about mulberry trees and some, is it native to our area? And are there considerations for planting, cultivated species of something like mulberry?
I haven't planted mulberry. It's for several reasons. One is that it gets really big, and I generally don't want to plant a tree that is that big in the kind of gardens that I grow. So I can't help you there, but I will say that you want to consider what activity you're planning to pursue underneath that mulberry tree, because it makes a huge mess when those fruits come down. I mean, it is native, but you want to think about where you're going to plant it.
And a question about winterberry. Do
Mhm.
winterberry require full sun, and are birds attracted to them?
Birds are very much attracted to them. They flower and fruit better in full sun. You'll definitely do better. And the other thing about winterberry is that they are not naturally self-fertile. You're going to need a male pollinator. So you want to think about what winter berries you're going to be planting and make sure that you get the right pollinator that flowers at the same time as the female plants that you have. But yeah, it's a great plant. I love it.
And another question would be about what would we plant underneath a lilac bush that our little critters like rabbits that would stay away from when we're
Well,
planting?
um, alliums are always good for that. That's one of it's for the way that I come to this is actually what to plant around apple trees to keep rabbits and other creatures away. So I would suggest alliums. Usually, you can't get away with daffodils and that kind of stuff because they'll snap them right off. But most of those animals hate onions, so I would go with alliums.
Mhm. And I see another question from Chuck about what would make a good understory plant in a dry, shady area.
Dry shade. Um, I can't tell you whether or not this is native, but you might want to look at a plant called epimedium because it grows very well in dry shade and it's a nice ground cover plant.
Mhm.
And it has tiny and very beautiful flowers.
Great. Do you have any suggestions about clumping grass that would stay somewhat short for an area with full sun?
Hmm. You know, I apologize, but I've gotten away from the grasses and I don't really know, I don't know them very well. So I apologize, but I really don't know the grasses.
Mhm. Another question about blueberries. Do you
Mhm.
need different varieties of blueberries to cross-pollinate for fruit production?
In the case of the wild blueberries, no. But if you're growing cultivated varieties, then yes, it's you don't it's not absolutely necessary, but is recommended that you have more than one variety, that you'll get better fruit set if you do.
Mhm. So there's a couple of propagating questions. Is now a good time to propagate any of these woody species that we might have in our landscape already? Specifically, maybe spirea or winterberry or elderberry?
Yes. If you're, that is to say, if you're, because we have people in all different areas. So, for example, where I live, you can't work the ground at all at this point. It's too wet. But if you're at a point where the ground has dried out a bit and you can actually be working in there, then yes, you can start propagating them. I would say what you're looking for, and it depends on what you mean by propagating. If you're planning on bending over a few branches and keeping them secured there on the ground with a rock so that they'll root and create a new plant, that's when you want to be able to get in there and work in soil that's already dried out a bit. If you're talking about taking softwood cuttings, then you're going to want to wait until the plant itself grows up, has some new growth for the season, maybe 2 to 4 inches before you start taking softwood cuttings off. And in that case, you'll be wanting to dip it in a rooting powder or a rooting gel and put it in another pot. So if it's that kind of a propagation, then you'll have to wait till it grows a bit.
And what about elderberries?
Oh, what
Propagating.
about them? Okay, propagating them. I haven't actually tried it, but elderberries elderberries are a funny plant. The the wood on them is pretty short-lived. So by which I mean that you'll find that you've got every spring you're going to have dead wood that you want to cut out. And if you really want to propagate, then I would suggest cutting it back, let's say, or cut the whole thing or cut sections of it only a foot or two from the ground. And once you start to get new shoots on, then you can be taking those shoots off. And again, make sure that you've got a rooting powder or a rooting gel and get the thing in the ground.
And do you ever use currants in any of your plantings?
I do. I've had a little trouble with currants in the recent past because of a currant worm that comes in and just defoliates the plant. But they do it really fast, and they don't kill the plant, and they don't kill the berries either. So, um, yeah, I've done red currants. They're kind of fun, and I suggest that you look into how you want to use them. If you want to use them as juice, for example, you can smash them and get the juice to run out, and then you will have the juice or the nectar. And they do have a tiny little seed in them, so eating handfuls of currants can be a little tricky. But it's the red ones that I'm familiar with, and you want to watch out for those currant worms. So,
Mhm.
but don't freak out if you see them because they're going to do their thing and then they're going to go away.
And I have heard there was a currants for a while were a commercial crop, and then they were sort of wiped off the landscape because of the white pine blister rust. But I think
Right.
there are now some um, varieties that are, you know,
You want to check in your state and maybe even in your town to see whether or not it's legal for you to plant currants before you invest in them. So it depends upon where you're living. In some places, currants are allowed back in, and in some they're not. So do some research first before you get into it.
yeah. And there's a question about nut trees.
Mhm.
Would, are there any nut trees that you might recommend if someone has enough space for them?
Oh, yeah, nut trees, the walnuts, you have to be pretty convinced that that's what you want because walnuts will are called euglones, and they will exude a compound into the soil that will keep anything else from growing underneath them. So, you know, make sure that that's what you want to do and that you have enough space for them because you won't be able to grow anything underneath a walnut. Um, the hazelnuts are a possibility. They're not a, they're not a big crop in our area. They're a little tricky, but you can grow hazelnuts here in the Northeast. So you want to watch the varieties that you get for those. That's a possibility. I'm not growing nuts. I don't want, I personally, I just like don't, I've never really gotten the hang of how you keep the birds away from them. So
Hmm.
that's a little tricky.
Hmm. And in the last few minutes, would you speak a little bit about where you like to source some of your plants? You mentioned Nasami, and someone asked about, bringing plants in from maybe some of the, bigger box stores. What do you think of sourcing your plants from those places?
Oh, well, I hope this doesn't get me in trouble. I don't buy anything from box stores. I mean, if you're there and this stuff is coming right off the truck, then I suppose that might be okay. I don't know how many natives you're going to find by doing that. I haven't really tried it. As it happens, my local nursery is Ward's Nursery, and I love them. They are wonderful. And speaking more generally, I think having a relationship with a local nursery is really a great idea because they can tell you what will work successfully in your area and what won't. They can order things for you if they don't have them in stock. So, I really love having a relationship with Wards. That works for me perfectly. If you have someplace like the Native Plant Trust, or it's Western Mass operation, the Nasami Farm, that where you can get your natives. I definitely would recommend checking them out um, because they're great and they're very well informed. So one of the reasons to have a relationship with a nursery, whether for natives or for some other plant, is to be able to go and ask questions and get answers that maybe you can't get out of books. You know, um, uh, I know I'm sorry about the groaner here, but the fact is that plants don't read books. So it's a really good idea to talk to people about what grows in your region or right in your area when you're looking to plant things.
Mhm. And Melinda asked about the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. Do you source any plants from them?
I have not. I have not, so I can't really speak about it.
Great. Well, I think I'm going to just wrap up by saying that I've just put into the chat a couple of links again from Ruth, who has provided a reading list with some additional sources. Ruth, do you want to mention what's on a little bit about the reading list?
Sure. There's let's see. The Bill Kalina books are great. They're not just for New England, but they have some great information both about natives and also about propagation. As far as learning more about insects and other pollinators, of course, the Doug Tallamy's book is really good, called Bringing Nature Home. I love the Eric Grissel books. They how shall I put it? They can make your eyes glaze over with the amount of detail because he's a scientist, and so the beginning of those books can be a little tough going, but his discussions of diversity in the garden are fantastic, not to be missed. In terms of looking at uncommon fruits to grow, I definitely would go to Farming on the Wild Side by Nancy and John Hayden. That's a fantastic book. And then as far as attracting native pollinators, the books by Eric Mader and his group from the Xerces Society are also really good. And for our region, Eric Tonesmeyer's Paradise Lost is a great resource.
And I love the Essex County Greenbelt Association. We are great partners in a lot of ways, and they are hosting an event with Doug Tallamy coming up in April, on April 28th. So I just put in a link to the Essex County Greenbelt Association for an online event that is free to join with Doug Tallamy.
Great idea.
Yeah. As well, I put the link in there for your plant list. So that's in there. And again, I will send out that information in a follow-up email as well. So I think that's it for tonight. I want to respect all of our time. Thank you, Ruth, so much for all that great insight and information. And again, thank you everyone who's here for your participation and your great questions. I have Rafi, thank you for dropping some of these links into the chat. There's a link to the evaluation for this event. And again, if you love the work we do, please become a member or make a small donation to help support us. Thanks again to our sponsors, Chelsea Green, Ward's Nursery, and New England Biolabs. From everyone at NOFA Mass, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time.